Alrighty, so new album's out over here, Spotify, YouTube, whatever. That's not what this video is about. I mean, loosely it is, but basically I did a video on Suno. They have their hooks feature now, so you can put on some short videos on there, basically going into like the background on one specific song. But for the Patreon, I wanted to go like more into technical depth in terms of like some of the techniques that were used. These are techniques that I haven't shared yet because I've been working on them to basically refine them and make it something that I could share, and also, you know, be sure of what was going on exactly. So let's get into that. First off, here, let me change screens. All right, so to see the first technique that was used, this was sort of a basis for aspects of it. You're gonna have to go, you go to Discret, you go to Code, and you go to Audio Interpolator. It's not really an interpolator, it was intended to be an interpolator. Interpolation versus averaging, at least to my basic knowledge, is that interpolation is basically an average, except you can set the amount, the scale of the averaging, whereas you know, a straight average, if you know, everybody knows what an average is. So what this did, very, very basically, was it averaged audio waves, or sound waves. So the idea behind this was that you would take a whole bunch of different songs that for Suno, you know, or for any sort of audio model, may have, you know, some sort of, it perceives songs in a way that a human being doesn't, right? It seems very similar to us, and it is. It converges towards our tastes and preferences, and therefore, in some sense, it thinks kind of like us about music, but it's not even close to the same as us. And so at the end of the day, one thing that you'll notice, one thing that people have noticed with most of these models is that you can use just straight averaging with model weights in general, with stuff called, like, they call them like model soups, where you basically just take a whole bunch of good models and you just straight up average their weights, and somehow magically what you get out produces good results. And it's not really magic if you think about it. There's all these different signals that are basically carried by the relationship between these weights, you know, based upon, since each one represents essentially a function that, you know, maps a bunch of inputs, your prompts or conditioning, to outputs, which is your final music, and it's just a fuzzy sort of a function. It's not a clearly defined function like in maths. So you have these various functions. When you average all of them, you know, each one is going to have all these different sorts of, I guess you would say, signals, basically, is what I like to call them. But, you know, different sort of paths for these inputs and outputs. What's unique is that, I've gone over this before, all the different models that you're choosing, generally speaking, they're going to be ones that are liked by people. You're not going to do a model soup of bad models, meaning that the areas of similarity between the models in terms of their weights are going to be reinforced, right, in an average, and the areas of difference are going to be degraded in an averaging. Because, like, if you have, for example, if we're averaging a bunch of weights and two of the weights are both very, very high across both models, and the rest of the weights are, you know, some of them might be high, some of them might be low, the average of high and low is going to be lower, but the average of two high weights is going to remain high or elevated. And so what ends up happening is, basically across all of them, it's just going to preserve the features that are similar. And since all of them are human preferenced, right, they're all, you know, basically biased towards what people like, you're basically just capturing a narrowish window of the specific features that are well liked by people. And then the other features are going to be somewhat suppressed, and the exact amount they'll be suppressed is relative to how common they are across all these models. Now, of course, this does mess with, it's lossy in the sense that, you know, it's way more complex than that, how the insides of these models work. But that's also, what's fascinating about it is it's not really all that crazy. It's the same way that training models works. When you train a model, you know, your captioning data can be inaccurate. But if you have a lot of data that you force into the model, even if it's inaccurate by some percentage, because it's mostly accurate, in order for the model to accurately reduce the loss, in other words, get it right more often than not, it's going to actually still converge towards truth. Now, that gap in terms of accuracy still does matter in terms of what I would call ultimately the resolution at which it's able to, you know, observe this concept. But basically, It's sort of like if you show someone a picture of a face, but a part of the face is always blurry, and you show them a million faces with a part of the face always blurry, and you ask it to draw a face. Now, it might generalize the idea of having a part of the face blurry, but actually, in reality, it probably won't. Because in order to reduce loss, it'll never know which part of the face is blurry. And if it blurs a part of the face, the chance of it being right when it's asked to draw a face is reduced, because the chance of it guessing the correct blurry part is very, very, very uncommon. But the chances of it, if it just draws the face correctly across the entire face, it'll only always get wrong the blurry portion, if that makes sense. So this is sort of how they reduce loss, and so in turn, you can leverage this, the same law of basically big numbers in terms of data, in order to communicate stuff, in order to average models themselves, and basically leverage that same sort of impact or same sort of effect, just from a different angle. And then lastly, at inference, this is the part where most people miss, in my opinion, but at inference, the same laws apply, the same rules work. In essence, you can take an inaccurate representation of something, but if you have enough inaccurate representations, as long as it's mostly accurate, you will end up converging towards an understanding of what you're doing. And so averaging something like a sound wave is like the worst way you could do something, right? If these models are using a VAE, like a variational autoencoder, where they're taking the music and they're basically encoding it into this latent space that captures features, etc., that's going to be way more effective in terms of knowing how to merge songs in a way that actually captures the features you're trying to capture. But we don't have access to that, right? So we have to find dirty ways to try and mix things together and capture the positive elements of different tracks without, because I was interested in doing this outside of Suno because Suno has limitations, right? Refusion as well has limitations in this regard. You can only use so much audio conditioning at once. And I want to use big numbers. Like I want to be able to use 64 songs if I want to. Because I genuinely believe that this makes a substantial difference. The bigger it gets, the more you need to go up another step, basically. But that's not a problem. We have a lot of music. So being able to steer in this way was useful to me. So what I did for this one was I took all of my wife's tracks and I basically averaged their sound waves in here. You can also use normalization. What normalization does here is it will take the total amount of sound across all the songs and make them all have the same total amount of sound. Basically, it'll reduce volume or increase volume towards some sort of a base middle, and then combine them all. I didn't usually use this because, again, with big numbers, eventually it all converges. So it becomes less of a concern when you're using a lot of tracks at once, when you're merging a lot of different sounds at once. Let me pause. Okay, so that's the first part. We'll go ahead and I'll just show you an example of how this sounds. We'll take a couple tracks here. Okay, just some random tracks, and we'll average them. This can run. This all runs locally. It can run on your home phone, but you'll hear how chaotic this is. Make sure the volume's high enough that it's audible. So that's total nonsense, right? You do that with enough tracks, and you essentially just get this blurry mush. And when you upload that to Suno, it has no idea what that blurry mush means. However, and I will say this is not a perfect method. This method actually is much worse. Well, it seems to be worse than another method I ended up using later on, and I'll show you that next. But this did work. First off, there's a whole bunch of different tracks I made that were instrumental that are going to be on the next album, which is going to be 8. It's just 8 instrumental tracks that use this method almost entirely. I just took a bunch of my instrumental stuff that I liked, I merged it all in here, and I used that as audio conditioning, and I ended up getting 4.5 plus to go to a place that I'd never been before, and then from there I built it into version 5. So this itself, even if you're not getting exactly what you want, right? I don't think that this is a end-all be-all where you're going to always capture the features that are desirable, etc. However, let me try and give you a way to think about this that helps you to understand why this might work. Let's say you had all of Nirvana's tracks that existed, and you blurred them into this blurry mush. It will mean nothing to you. You will not recognize an ounce of Nirvana in the blurry mush that you get. However, a model, there's going to be something similar in the recording quality between all of these tracks that you've merged into this blurry mush, right? And just like we just talked about with model merging in a model soup, where the features that are preserved are the ones that are shared across all of them. So too, in this, the features that will be preserved are going to be the areas of the sound wave that were similar. And so there's a strong chance that if the model has an understanding of this particular, that there's a strong chance that in order to converge, in order to minimize loss on that particular group of tracks, the model will understand what those really, really small differences in sound mean. It's not a 100%, but the reality is as models, get more and more data, this kind of stuff becomes increasingly reliable because these models basically all, again, sort of converge themselves. And their understandings of things become kind of complete in a lot of ways. So here, what we're basically trying to capture are similarities in sound across a bunch of different things. Now, here's the thing. What I really want to capture most of the time isn't that. I want to capture something deeper. I'm trying to capture like compositional quality. Like I might want to merge a bunch of songs from totally different genres, totally different creators, and then get something, see, can it capture basically this good concept, my preference? In many cases, it actually can. Now, I will also say that this can introduce stabilization in some models, and other models it can introduce destabilization. It also depends largely on what music you've put together. In other words, it is hit or miss, but once you come across I would say it's mostly hit, for one. I would say the next method I'll show you was about 50-50. This method, especially on 4.5 plus, worked quite well for me. But yeah, let's move on to the next one, which is using a variational audio encoder. Alrighty, here we are in Comfy UI now. For those of you unfamiliar, this is a node-based workflow platform. Let's get close enough that we can actually see what I'm doing here. And so I used a couple. There's a couple different big open source audio projects right now with a VAE that's included with them. The idea here was to do the same exact interpolation process, or not interpolation in this case, to do exactly the same averaging, but to do it instead in a latent space. Specifically, I wanted a high quality latent space that had, appeared to wasn't too compressed to where when I got something out, it couldn't reproduce the song again. So basically, I tested all the different VAEs, and I would compress their song using their VAE, which basically takes the song, turns it into a bunch of, I'm assuming matrices, but basically into a bunch of numbers. And then and this is a lossy process. It then it uses the same variational audio encoder to then decompress it, to turn it back into music by recognizing this compressed file or compressed set of matrices. And so the variational audio encoders are lossy. So when you compress something and then decompress it, it will come out the other side a little bit different. However, it should be as close as possible to your original input if you have done no modifications to it. And so that's what I tested. I found first off that one of the best models that is out there, not stable audio, it's actually called A-Step, I think it's called. Or was it A-Step? I can't remember, but I think it was A-Step. A-Step is really, really good. However, their variational audio encoder is garbage. When you put in something and you take it out, it comes out choppy no matter what you do, which means that no matter how good the song you create with it is, it's always going to come out choppy because their VAE is trash. So it's unfortunate. Stable audio, on the other hand, the audio you put in is very, very close to the audio you put out. So this is the one I ended up going with as my established baseline. It takes a little bit longer to encode, so clearly their VAE is probably larger, substantially larger than the A-Step one. It also doesn't compress as much. So that's desirable to me. The main idea with the VAE is the VAE is trained in such a way, it's fed a ton of data, and then it has to learn how to basically compress this data in a very, very efficient way. And what that ultimately means is it's going to recognize features that are shared across the data in ways that it's able to basically categorize. And so when you're averaging things in the space, it means that you're actually going to average those features. Now, this can be useful because it means that you're in some ways more likely, perhaps, to capture when you're doing a model soup, or in this case, a song soup. You may be more likely to capture some compositional features or other things that are just not really tangible to you as a human being, but that the model is going to have recognized. So I did that as well. And this is actually the method I ended up using to capture certain shoegazy elements from my wife's music for the album. I did this with, I think, 32 songs. And then I did this a bunch with some of my other songs to add some additional preference stuff in it. And then I took all of those songs together and I put them into some inspo stuff. So let me show you some of that now so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. Oh, actually, before we move on from this, I did want to note one more thing, which is that, first off, I wanted to show you the actual mean process. So you have, the songs are loaded up, they're encoded using the VAE. You go to the means, which can be arithmetic or geometric. Geometric is garbage, it doesn't work right. Arithmetic is the way to go. And you can do cropped in, cropped to start. I tried to variate this. I don't know what's the correct answer here, to be honest with you. Maybe it's best if I stretch the music, but I was concerned using stretching there would be issues. I probably should have just done stretching, in my opinion, and that might be what I'll change in this. But this is a custom node. Maybe I'll modify it and eventually upload the node that actually does averaging by default in Comfy UI doesn't actually do averaging. It actually, when it averages latents, it does some other stuff, and so you don't get a pure average. And you want a pure average. You just want a lot of data. So yeah, I'll see if I can upload that at some point. I just need to clean it up because I don't like the crop to start, crop to front thing. There's some issues with specifically the ones that were built off of starts, because I think it's basically something to do with the way the music is aligning. Yeah, so that's how the averaging there works. Let's go to Suno now and we'll look at some of the inspo stuff. Okay, so here we have School Play, which is the song I did the hook about.
So beautiful, come back with us. No, brother.
It's got a cool progression. It sounds very, very natural. I like this one a lot. I've already copied it and brought it over into Hipster, which is on Discrot. Very useful for looking up how songs were created. And so this one was actually made in one shot, but was it actually made in one shot? Well, let's see. It was inspoed by a playlist. Let's go to that playlist. It's called Wonder. What do we have here? 2 tracks that are nothing. All right, so these were both done using that method. These are VAE merged averages of a ton of songs from my wife and from myself. And what I found was some of them would destabilize it, but some of them, you know, when you had it super duper stable, you would be able to do things like push, if you look at the sliders, right? You have the weirdness slider and you have the style influence. If you've played with these, you'll understand when you go to 100% on weirdness, it degrades pretty rapidly into nonsense. But with those averaged merges in there, you could push it all the way to 100% and have style influence at like 85%, and it would be stable the entire way through. That doesn't mean that those were the best settings to use. I'm just saying that it was stable. And the way that I play with sliders in general is I'm looking to make this band of stability as big as I possibly can. Because generally that means when I smack myself in the middle of that stable band, by stable it means where I'm getting wins across a whole band. If I smack myself in the middle of that band, I'm usually going to get extremely good results after doing a bunch of gens. So that's just my experience. I have reasons to believe that, but I haven't really done any firm testing on that. So that is just an intuition of mine. But anyway, so you can see, you know, essentially capturing music in that way, minimally, right? Even if you're not actually getting the features from your songs, which I did see. But let's just say that the particular ones you merged, it's not giving you exactly what you want. You're getting something different, some different type of conditioning that you're feeding to the model, which means that by definition, your output is going to be unique. It's not going to be the same as every other output that's being produced. So it's just allowing you another lever to turn or rotate or whatever. But more importantly, it's not just giving you, like when you're just using 4 songs or something like that in inspo, like you normally would, those songs have such a heavy influence, it can very rapidly become choppy if your settings aren't exactly tuned just right, if your sliders aren't on inspo. But if you're using merges of songs, you get way more leeway, and you still manage to capture a lot of the features. Sometimes the features it captures are not exactly right, or I'm just like surprised, but I see it. Right? There's a couple, when I merged a whole bunch of songs together, a couple times where I got funk out of it. And when I went back over those songs, I was like, I could kind of see, right, across the entire band of them, what there was this sort of like, almost like R&B-ish background beat, which I have in a lot of my stuff. There's a lot of elements from trap and stuff like that, which was, of course, influenced ultimately, sort of a progression of those. And so the core, if I'm diverging in these different directions, ends up being this weird funky sound. So you'll end up finding some weird stuff like that, and I had no problem against funk or anything like that, but I didn't particularly want funk out of this set. But again, it takes 5 seconds to go ahead and average some songs and see what you get when you're doing an inspo. I haven't tried covering off of these much. I think I've done it once or twice. It works fine, but it's not. The reason why I do inspo is because the way I figure is the same exact rule of averages. If one of the merges was bad, then I have 4 of them in there, and whatever it is, whatever process Suno has doing in the background on this, it'll work. The same thing also on Refusion. I did the same thing with vibes, where I took these merges, I used the merges to make vibes. I had less success on vibes. I think the way that vibes work is fundamentally different. I don't know if vibes has some sort of an adapter that's basically reading the song and converting it into something that the model understands, or if it's like directly plopping it in there and then it's causing degradation in that way. I really don't know. I don't know what the differences are there. There is some beta features which I can't talk about that I was able to use with Refusion using this method, and those did work quite well. Or maybe they're alpha features, I don't know. But so it's not 100%. I think that feature is probably more similar to how inspo works, if I had to take a guess based on the similarities between them. But yeah, so effectively, the methods I want to talk about here were basically those average methods. I talked about it some in the Discord just when I was testing it at first, but I hadn't really gone into the reasoning behind it and all this sorts of stuff. But in summation, you have a bunch of data. Anytime you have a bunch of data, it doesn't really matter how you glob it together. If you glob it all together, the signal that is going to be preserved, because your data is just a signal for a model, and then the model is going to take that signal and give you an output from it. But that signal that is preserved within those different views, those different data points, is going to be the commonalities between them. And that's the important thing to remember, because when you remember that, you start to see why averaging is intrinsically valuable, because it's just a form of natural selection. You are basically creating a process whereby you are preserving good features and discarding bad features. It's not necessarily the case, by the way. Some people will be going, well, but, and I'll give you the but right now. The but is that the way that the information is stored is being degraded, right? What I mean by this is the relationship between the weights internally on different models, for example, is relevant. Or in our case, when we're talking about these signals, right? The progression of a Nirvana song, right? The actual timing, the actual, not just like the specific sound at any given instant, but the sound across a wider, spectrum, how it moves over time. How is it going to capture that? And the answer is it's not going to capture that, right? It's because it's not relativistic. The way we have them merging, right? They're merging in a way that's essentially absolute. The absolute sound wave is merging with this absolute sound wave into an average of the two. And so the features that are getting preserved are basically the loudest sections in comparison with the less loud sections. The reason why it still ends up working, as weird as it is because the way the models interpret it, they're having to take all this data that they have, and they're having to reduce loss when they have to not reproduce it, but they have to produce something very similar to a bunch of data at once. And so what this means is, when they're processing the data, these sorts of averages are in some sense, well, not in some sense, it is the path of least resistance for it to be able to reduce that loss. And in a strange way, essentially, we're on the inference end, we're reproducing some aspects of how the model is likely to converge towards an understanding of that music. And so when we feed that to it as audio conditioning, we are basically giving the model information that it's able to understand. Even though it's not an average, even though it's not relativistic, the relationship between the sound itself internally is decoherent. It has been severed. That's why the music sounds decoherent when you do this with a bunch of songs. It just turns into noise, maybe with some like sudden explosive sounds in there. But that decoherent noise is going to have some